March 1943. The Tunisian desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its sands still warm from the blood of thousands. Corporal Giuseppe Russo of the RE Armored Division pressed his face against the scorching metal of his disabled M13/40 tank and watched American Sherman tanks roll past his position like mechanical predators. Around him, what remained of the Italian Africa Corps, Mussolini's once proud contribution to Rommel's desert campaign, raised white flags fashioned from torn undershirts and pillowcases. The sound of gunfire had ceased. The war, for Giuseppe and 8,000 other Italian soldiers captured in the final collapse of Axis forces in North Africa, had ended with a whimper of surrender rather than a bang of defiance. Giuseppe was 24 years old, a mathematics teacher from a small village outside Florence. He had been drafted in 1941, given 6 weeks of training, and shipped to Libya with promises of quick victory and Roman glory restored. Instead, he had spent 18 months dodging British artillery, eating sand-contaminated rations, and watching friends die from wounds that proper medical care might have prevented. Now, as American soldiers motioned him forward with their rifles, he felt only exhaustion and a strange, shameful relief. At least captivity meant he might survive to see his family again. The rumors began immediately. Whispered in the darkness of the holding pens near Tunis, passed between men huddled together for warmth despite the desert heat, amplified by fear and ignorance. Americans execute prisoners. They torture captives in revenge for Pearl Harbor. They're cowboys, barbarians who don't respect the Geneva Convention. Giuseppe didn't believe most of it. He had seen enough war to know that atrocity was distributed equally among all armies. But uncertainty gnawed at him as he and hundreds of other Italian POWs were marched to the port of Bizerta and loaded onto Liberty ships for the transatlantic crossing. The voyage lasted 2 weeks. Giuseppe spent most of it below decks in the converted cargo hold, surrounded by men who spoke in hushed Sicilian dialects, Roman slang, and the musical Venetian accent of the northern provinces. They were farmers and clerks, students and shopkeepers, united only by their brown uniforms and their shared defeat. The ocean swells made most men seasick. The close quarters bred rumor and speculation. Some claimed they were being taken to America to work as slaves in mines. Others insisted they would be used as human shields during the planned invasion of Italy. A few optimists suggested they might simply be held until the war ended, then repatriated. None of them could have imagined what actually awaited them. The ship docked at Newport News, Virginia on April 22, 1943. Giuseppe's first glimpse of America came through a porthole. Green hills, wooden houses with pitched roofs, a landscape so different from the Mediterranean that it might have been another planet. American soldiers, fresh-faced boys who looked too young to be in uniform, processed them with bureaucratic efficiency. Medical examinations, delousing, new clothes, olive-drab fatigues with PW stenciled on the back in white paint. Then trains. Giuseppe and 200 other Italian POWs were loaded onto passenger cars, not cattle cars as they had feared, but actual seats with cushions, and transported westward. Through the window, Giuseppe watched America scroll past like a fever dream. Endless forests. Small towns with white churches and baseball diamonds. Farmland so vast and fertile it made Italy's carefully terraced hillsides look like garden plots. The abundance was overwhelming. Even in the midst of war, America seemed untouched by scarcity. 3 days later, they arrived at Camp Hearn in Texas, 60 miles northwest of Houston. The camp was new, hastily constructed from raw lumber and concrete, surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire and anchored by guard towers at each corner. But as Giuseppe and his fellow prisoners were marched through the gates, they began to notice details that contradicted their expectations. The barracks were clean, with real beds and mattresses. There was a mess hall, a chapel, even a small library. Guards carried rifles, but didn't point them threateningly. The camp commander, a middle-aged major named Wilson who spoke a few words of broken Italian, addressed them through a translator with something approaching courtesy. "Welcome to Texas," the translator repeated in Italian. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive the same rations as American soldiers. You will work, but you will be paid. You will write letters to your families. Any man who attempts escape will be punished, but no man will be harmed without cause." The Italians looked at each other in disbelief. This was not what prisoners of war received. This was more than they had received in their own army. The first days passed in a haze of adjustment. Giuseppe and the others learned the routines of camp life: roll calls, work assignments, meal schedules. Some men were sent to nearby farms to harvest cotton or pick vegetables, work that was hard but no harder than what they had done at home. Others maintained the camp itself, repairing buildings, tending gardens, cooking in the kitchens. The food was astonishing: white bread, real butter, beef, vegetables, coffee. After months of desert rations consisting mainly of hardtack and canned sardines, the American abundance seemed almost obscene. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for that first Saturday afternoon in May when the guards led them to a fenced area adjacent to the camp and told them to watch. Giuseppe stood among a crowd of Italian POWs, perhaps 300 men pressed against the chain-link fence, staring at what appeared to be a carefully manicured field of short grass marked with white lines and strange geometric patterns. At one end was a raised mound of dirt. At the other, a pentagon outlined in chalk. In between, 3 more pentagons arranged in a diamond pattern. American soldiers, off-duty guards, and administrative personnel were gathering on the field, wearing matching uniforms of white and gray, carrying wooden clubs and leather gloves. "What is this?" Giuseppe asked no one in particular. No one answered because no one knew. Then the game began. One American stood on the dirt mound, winding his arm in elaborate circles before hurling a small white ball toward another American who crouched behind the pentagon at the far end of the diamond. The crouching man caught the ball in an oversized leather glove. A third American stood between them holding a wooden club. No, a bat, Giuseppe would later learn, and swung at empty air as the ball passed. "Strike one," shouted a fourth American wearing black, standing behind the croucher. The Italian prisoners watched in absolute silence, their faces registering confusion, bewilderment, and growing incredulity. The Americans repeated the process. Ball thrown. Bat swung. Ball caught. The man in black shouted again. The crowd of Americans watching from wooden benches cheered or groaned, depending on some invisible logic that the Italians could not decipher. Giuseppe turned to Private Angelo Benedetti from Naples, a former fisherman who stood beside him. "Angelo, do you understand this?" Angelo's weathered face was creased with confusion. "Is it training? Some kind of American military drill? With a wooden stick? Maybe it's a ritual. Americans are strange. Maybe this is how they pray to their god of war." The game continued. Sometimes the American with the bat would actually hit the ball, sending it flying through the air or bouncing across the grass. When this happened, other Americans wearing gloves would chase it frantically while the batter dropped his club and ran in a circular pattern, touching each pentagon before returning to where he started. The entire sequence made no logical sense. "He runs in a circle," Giuseppe muttered. "Why does he run in a circle? And why do they try to catch the ball?" Angelo added, "What is the purpose?" Around them, other Italian prisoners were equally mystified. Some laughed nervously, convinced this was some elaborate American joke at their expense. Others watched with the intense concentration of men trying to solve a mathematical proof. A few simply shook their heads and walked away, unable to process what they were witnessing. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These were the same Americans whose bombers were reducing Italian cities to rubble, whose armies were preparing to invade Sicily and then the Italian mainland, whose industrial might was crushing the Axis under an avalanche of steel and explosives. Yet here they were, on a Saturday afternoon, playing what appeared to be a children's game with rules so arcane that university-educated men couldn't comprehend them after 20 minutes of observation. Giuseppe found himself mesmerized not by the game itself, which remained utterly incomprehensible, but by the Americans playing it. They argued passionately about invisible infractions. They celebrated successful hits with backslaps and whoops of joy. They groaned in theatrical despair when a ball was caught before touching the ground. They were completely, unselfconsciously absorbed in this bizarre ritual, as if nothing else in the world mattered. Not the war, not the prisoners watching them, not the fact that tomorrow they might be shipping out to invade Europe. "They're insane," Angelo said quietly. "The Americans are completely insane." Giuseppe couldn't disagree. But there was something else in the observation, something he couldn't quite articulate. The Americans weren't performing for the prisoners. They weren't trying to demonstrate superiority or mock their captives. They were simply playing, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if war and sport existed in completely separate mental compartments that never contaminated each other. Over the following weeks, Baseball became a fixture of camp life every Saturday and Sunday afternoon. The Italian prisoners were always invited, or perhaps required, to watch. Giuseppe began to recognize patterns. The man throwing the ball, the pitcher, he learned, was trying to throw it past the batter in a designated strike zone. The batter was trying to hit it far enough that he could complete his circular run, touching all 4 bases and returning home, before the defensive players could retrieve the ball and throw it to a base ahead of him. There were outs and innings, balls and strikes, a complex system of rules that governed every action. But beyond the mechanics, Giuseppe began to understand something deeper about American culture. Baseball wasn't just a game. It was a ritual of normalcy, a way to impose order and tradition on the chaos of wartime. The Americans played it with the same seriousness they applied to warfare, but also with a joy that warfare could never provide. Watching them, Giuseppe realized that this was how Americans remained sane in the midst of global conflict. They carried home with them, packaged in innings and box scores. The other Italian prisoners had varying reactions. Some, mostly younger men from northern industrial cities, became fascinated by the game's complexity and began debating its finer points in animated discussions. Others, particularly older farmers from the South, dismissed it as frivolous nonsense unworthy of men at war. A few simply stopped attending, preferring to spend their free time writing letters or tending the small vegetable gardens they were permitted to maintain. Giuseppe fell into the first category. As a mathematician, he was drawn to baseball's statistical nature. He began keeping notes in the margins of an old textbook he had carried since Tunisia, recording observations about batting averages, earned run averages, fielding percentages. The translator, a second-generation Italian-American named Corporal Vittorio Lombardi, noticed Giuseppe's interest and began explaining the rules in detail during their conversations. "Baseball is America," Vittorio said one afternoon in June, speaking in a mixture of English and Italian. "It's about fairness. Everyone gets the same number of chances. It's about individual achievement within team structure. It's about statistics and logic, but also about moments of unexpected brilliance. In Italy, you have calcio football. It's beautiful, fluid, artistic. Baseball is different. It's more mechanical, more deliberate, very American." Giuseppe considered this. But why play it during war? Why maintain this ritual when men are dying? Vittorio looked surprised by the question. "Because we're not savages. Because civilization means maintaining the things that make life worth living, even when life is cheapest. My father told me that in the last war, soldiers played baseball in the trenches between artillery barrages. It reminded them they were still human." That conversation stayed with Giuseppe. It crystallized something he had been struggling to understand about his captors. Americans fought wars pragmatically, industrially, with overwhelming force and mechanical efficiency. But they also compartmentalized warfare in a way that Europeans, shaped by centuries of total war and existential conflicts, could not. Americans could be at war and at peace simultaneously. They could kill you in the morning and play a game in the afternoon without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that would paralyze a European mind. In July 1943, everything changed. The camp loudspeakers crackled to life early one morning with news that Allied forces had invaded Sicily. Giuseppe's island homeland was now a battlefield. Many Italian prisoners gathered in the recreation hall, listening to radio broadcasts that described American and British troops advancing against German and Italian defenders. The news was fragmentary, often contradictory, but the general trend was clear: Italy was losing. That afternoon, baseball was scheduled as usual. Giuseppe expected it to be canceled out of sensitivity to the Italian prisoners whose homeland was being invaded. It was not. American soldiers took the field exactly as they had every Saturday before. But this time, when the game began, something unprecedented happened. Captain Robert "Red" Harrison, the camp's assistant athletic officer, a position that Giuseppe had learned actually existed in the American military, walked to the fence where Italian prisoners stood watching. He was a tall man with rusty hair and freckled skin sunburned from the Texas heat. Through Corporal Lombardi, he addressed the prisoners. "Men, I know today is difficult. Your country is now the battlefield. Many of you have families in Sicily. But I want you to know something. We don't hate Italians. Most of us have Italian blood ourselves. We're fighting fascism, not you. And I'm going to make you an offer. Any man who wants to learn this game, who wants to play, is welcome to join us. Not today. Today you should think and pray. But next week, if you want, we'll teach you baseball. The translation caused a ripple of shock through the Italian prisoners. Several men shouted immediate refusals. "We are soldiers, not clowns," one man yelled. "We will not entertain our captors," another added. But others remained silent, considering. Giuseppe found himself in the second group. The invitation was so unexpected, so contrary to every understanding of how prisoner-captor relationships functioned, that it demanded consideration. What did it mean? Was it kindness? Manipulation? An attempt to demoralize them by forcing collaboration? Or was it simply what it appeared to be, an offer to share something Americans valued? That night, Giuseppe lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling and thinking about baseball, about war, about the impossible contradictions of American character. The same nation that had just invaded his homeland had offered him a chance to play their national game. The same men who were dropping bombs on Italian cities wanted to teach him batting stances and fielding positions. It was incomprehensible. It was offensive. It was intriguing. The following Saturday, Giuseppe made his decision. He walked to the field. He was not alone. About 30 Italian prisoners joined him, a mixture of curious younger men and older soldiers who simply wanted something, anything, to break the monotony of captivity. Captain Harrison greeted them with genuine enthusiasm, as if they were recruits joining a local amateur team rather than enemy prisoners of war. What followed was awkward, hilarious, and strangely moving. The Americans demonstrated batting stances, but Italian prisoners held the bats incorrectly, gripping them like axes or clubs. They explained base running, but prisoners ran counterclockwise instead of clockwise, drawing shouts of correction. They showed how to field ground balls, but the Italians, many of whom had never worn a baseball glove, caught the balls against their chests or let them bounce away. Angelo Benedetti, the Neapolitan fisherman, took his first swing at a pitched ball and spun completely around from the force of his own momentum, falling face first into the dirt. The American soldiers laughed, but not cruelly. They were the laughs of men who remembered their own early attempts. Captain Harrison helped Angelo to his feet, demonstrated the proper stance again, and pitched another ball. This time, Angelo made contact, sending a weak grounder toward third base. The Americans cheered as if he had hit a home run. Giuseppe's turn came. He stepped to the plate, home plate, he had learned, and faced Private Miller, the young Kansan who was pitching. Miller's first throw sailed past Giuseppe before he could react. Strike one. Giuseppe adjusted his stance, trying to implement everything Captain Harrison had demonstrated. The second pitch came. Giuseppe swung. The bat made contact with a satisfying crack, and the ball arced into the outfield. Giuseppe stood frozen, shocked that he had actually hit it. "Run!" Every American and Italian in the vicinity shouted simultaneously. "Run to first base." Giuseppe ran, his boots kicking up dust, and reached the white bag a moment before the thrown ball. He was safe. He had successfully completed a basic baseball play, and the feeling was unexpectedly exhilarating. Over the next 2 hours, American soldiers patiently taught Italian prisoners the fundamentals of baseball. Language barriers dissolved through gesture and demonstration. When an Italian player made a good catch, Americans applauded. When an American made a spectacular play, Italians cheered despite themselves. Nationalities became temporarily irrelevant. They were just men playing a game on a dusty Texas field while the world burned. That evening, Giuseppe sat in the barracks writing in his journal. Other prisoners who had played were discussing the day's events with animation they hadn't shown since capture. Angelo was demonstrating his swing to a group of skeptical Southerners. Private Caruso from Milan, who had turned an impressive double play, was being called Il Campione by his bunkmates. Giuseppe wrote, "Today I played baseball for the first time. I do not fully understand this game, but I understand something about the Americans. They wage war with the same efficiency they bring to industry, but they do not allow war to consume their souls. They remain capable of joy, of frivolity, of treating enemies as potential friends. This is either a great strength or a great naivete. I cannot yet determine which." By August 1943, baseball games between Americans and Italians were regular Saturday events at Camp Hearn. The matches were not competitive, the skill gap was far too wide, but they were genuine. Italian players slowly improved. They learned to read pitches, to position themselves defensively, to understand the tactical complexity beneath baseball's simple surface. Some men developed real skill. Angelo Benedetti became known for his surprisingly accurate throws from the outfield. Giuseppe, applying his mathematical mind to batting, learned to predict pitch locations based on count and situation. But the most significant transformation was psychological. The games created a space where the war temporarily ceased to exist. During those 2 hours every Saturday, Americans and Italians were not captors and prisoners, not enemies on opposite sides of a global conflict. They were teammates and opponents in a game that demanded cooperation and respect regardless of nationality. The guards who played baseball with prisoners began to see them as individuals rather than an undifferentiated mass of enemy soldiers. The prisoners began to understand Americans as complex humans rather than faceless representatives of an alien culture. Friendships formed. Not deep friendships, the circumstances prevented that, but genuine connections based on shared experience. In September 1943, news arrived that Italy had surrendered to the Allies. The camp erupted in confusion and celebration. Italian prisoners were no longer enemy combatants, but rather co-belligerents whose country had switched sides. Their status in American law remained unchanged. They were still POWs, but the psychological shift was profound. That Saturday's baseball game took on unexpected significance. The Italians suggested they play a proper match, 9 innings, regulation rules, Americans versus Italians. Captain Harrison agreed immediately. The game was announced throughout the camp. Guards and prisoners alike gathered to watch. The Italians lost 12-3. They made errors, struck out, missed fly balls. But they also played with enthusiasm and improving skill. In the 7th inning, Giuseppe hit a double that scored 2 runs, drawing cheers from both sides. Angelo Benedetti made a diving catch in center field that brought Americans to their feet in appreciation. After the final out, both teams lined up and shook hands, a baseball tradition that transcended all the boundaries of war and captivity. Captain Harrison told Lombardi to translate a message. "You men played well today. You're becoming real baseball players. When this war is over, when you go home to Italy, I hope you'll teach this game to your children. Maybe someday, Italian and American teams will play each other as allies and friends, not as enemies or prisoners. That's the real victory, not winning wars, but building peace." The words were sentimental, perhaps naive. But standing on that dusty baseball diamond in Texas, with the sun setting and the war continuing thousands of miles away, Giuseppe found himself believing them. Baseball had given him something he thought he had lost when he surrendered in Tunisia. Hope. Not hope for victory or escape, but hope that the world could be better than its worst impulses, that humans could choose connection over division, that play could be as powerful as violence. The baseball games continued through 1944 and into 1945. More Italian prisoners learned to play. The skill level rose gradually. A camp league was established with 4 teams, mixing Americans and Italians. Statistics were kept. Standings were posted. Men who had faced each other across battlefields now argued about batting averages and earned run averages. When news arrived of D-Day in June 1944, the baseball game scheduled for that afternoon proceeded as planned. When Rome was liberated, they played. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, they played. Baseball became the constant. The ritual that affirmed life continued regardless of history's upheavals. Giuseppe remained at Camp Hearn until October 1945, when Italian POWs began repatriation. Before leaving, he sought out Captain Harrison to say goodbye. Through Lombardi, he tried to express what the baseball games had meant, how they had preserved his sanity, reminded him of his humanity, shown him that enemies could become something approaching friends. Harrison gripped his hand firmly. "Take this with you," he said, pressing a baseball into Giuseppe's palm. "Teach someone in Italy how to play. Keep the game alive." Giuseppe returned to Florence in November 1945 to find his city damaged but intact, his family surviving but diminished. His brother had been killed fighting Germans in the north. His father had aged a decade in 4 years. Italy was broken, occupied, struggling to understand its place in the post-war world. But Giuseppe kept the baseball. And on Sunday afternoons in the village square, he taught neighborhood children an American game with incomprehensible rules. He drew diagrams in the dirt, demonstrated batting stances, explained the logic of base running. Most children found it confusing compared to calcio, which they understood instinctively. But a few became intrigued by this strange American sport. The game never took root in Italy the way Harrison had hoped. Baseball remained foreign, too structured, too American for the Italian temperament. But Giuseppe continued teaching it for years, a small act of remembrance and hope. The children who learned called it il gioco americano, the American game, and played it occasionally as a novelty before returning to their beloved football. Giuseppe kept a journal throughout his imprisonment, hundreds of pages of observations about American culture, baseball strategy, and the strange experience of captivity without cruelty. In 1963, during a cultural exchange program, he donated the journal to the Library of Congress. The final entry, written the night before he left Camp Hearn, contained his most profound observation about Americans and their national game. For 4 years, Europe tore itself apart in the most destructive war in human history. Millions died. Cities were reduced to rubble. Ancient hatreds consumed entire nations. And during those same 4 years, Americans played baseball. Not despite the war, but alongside it. They never allowed the war to become their entire identity. They remained capable of joy even in the midst of suffering, of play even while sending their sons to die on foreign soil. I understand now that this is America's greatest strength and perhaps Europe's fatal weakness. We allow our conflicts to consume us entirely. We cannot conceive of playing games while the world burns. Americans can. They compartmentalize in ways that seem almost schizophrenic to the European mind. But perhaps this is wisdom rather than madness. Perhaps maintaining joy in the midst of horror is how you avoid becoming the horror yourself. Baseball taught me this. A simple game with a stick and a ball, played on dusty fields by men who should have been enemies. It showed me that Americans fight wars not because they love violence, but because they love the peace that allows for games like baseball to exist. They want the world to be safe for the frivolous, the joyful, the unnecessary things that make life worth living. We Italians fought for glory, for empire, for abstract ideological visions. Americans fought so they could go home and play baseball. In the end, their pragmatism defeated our romanticism. Their joy defeated our nihilism. Their belief in simple pleasures defeated our worship of grand gestures. I return to Italy tomorrow carrying nothing but a baseball and a head full of incomprehensible American memories. I don't know if I can make my countrymen understand what I learned in that Texas prison camp. How do you explain that your captors defeated you not with cruelty, but with kindness? That they imprisoned your body, but freed your mind? That they showed you a better way to be human, even while destroying your armies? The baseball sits on my bunk, scuffed from use, signed by Captain Harrison and the other Americans who taught me to play. It is the most valuable thing I will take home from this war. Not because it's valuable in itself, but because it represents something I thought impossible. The idea that enemies can share joy, that war need not poison everything it touches, that humans can choose connection even in the midst of conflict. Americans are an impossible people. They wage industrial war with mechanical efficiency, then play children's games with passionate intensity. They destroy your armies, then invite you to share their national pastime. They are conquerors who treat prisoners better than their own armies treated them. They are idealists disguised as pragmatists, romantics who pretend to be cynics. I came to America as a prisoner expecting brutality. I leave as a baseball player with more questions than answers. The Italians who mock American culture as shallow and materialistic are wrong. The depth is there, but it's hidden beneath layers of optimism and informality that Europeans misread as naivete. Americans believe the world can be better, should be better, will be better. That belief is their weapon, more powerful than their bombers or tanks. Baseball is America. Complicated rules that somehow produce simple beauty. Individual achievement in service of team success. Moments of failure followed by chances at redemption. The belief that anyone, regardless of origin, can step to the plate and become a hero. The conviction that playing a game matters, that joy matters, that maintaining humanity in the midst of inhumanity is not weakness but strength. I don't know if I will ever truly understand Americans, but I understand baseball now, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the game is the message. Maybe the ability to play, even in the darkest hours, is what separates civilization from barbarism. Tomorrow I go home. Someday, perhaps, I will return to America as a visitor rather than a prisoner. I will watch a real baseball game in a real American stadium. I will cheer for players whose names I cannot pronounce, following a sport my countrymen will never embrace. And I will remember that spring afternoon in Texas when American soldiers taught Italian prisoners to play ball, and for a few hours, the war ceased to exist. That is America's victory. Not conquering Italy, but making me want to remember them fondly. Not defeating us in combat, but defeating the hatred that makes men eternally enemies. They didn't just win the war. They won the peace before the war even ended. That is a kind of genius that Europe has never produced. The baseball weighs almost nothing in my hand, but it carries the weight of this impossible, transformative experience. When I teach Italian children to play, I will be teaching them more than a game. I will be teaching them that yesterday's enemies can become today's teachers, that joy is resistance against hatred, that playing together heals what fighting tears apart. America defeated us with 805 machine guns and heavy bombers. But America also defeated us with baseballs and batting gloves. In the end, I think the baseballs were more effective. You can rebuild from destruction. It's harder to rebuild from kindness. Kindness disarms you completely. I leave Texas tomorrow as a different man than the one who arrived from Tunisia. The desert war seems like another lifetime, another person. That Giuseppe was a soldier who believed in glory and national pride. This Giuseppe is a baseball player who believes in simple human connection. The Americans gave me that transformation. They defeated me twice, once on the battlefield, once on the baseball diamond. But only the second defeat felt like victory. 70 years later, a researcher at the University of Texas discovered Giuseppe Russo's journal in the Library of Congress archives while conducting research on Italian POWs in America. The journal was translated and published in both English and Italian under the title The American Game, an Italian prisoner's discovery of baseball and brotherhood. The book became a minor bestseller in Italy, where readers were fascinated by this forgotten chapter of World War II history. Giuseppe's observations about American culture resonated with Italians who still struggled to understand their complicated transatlantic ally. His descriptions of learning baseball provided a lens through which to examine the cultural values embedded in sport. In 2015, the city of Florence erected a small monument in the square where Giuseppe had taught neighborhood children to play baseball after the war. The monument depicts a baseball resting on an open book with an inscription in Italian and English. Play is peace. Joy is resistance. Even enemies can become teammates. Captain Robert "Red" Harrison returned to his hometown in Ohio after the war and became a high school baseball coach. He never spoke publicly about his time running the athletic program at Camp Hearn, but his family found Giuseppe's letters among his belongings after his death in 1989. The two men had corresponded occasionally over the decades, brief notes exchanged between former captor and former prisoner who had become, impossibly, friends. Baseball never became popular in Italy. The game remained too American, too foreign, too structured for a culture that preferred the fluid improvisation of calcio. But in several small towns across Italy, Florence, Naples, Palermo, there exist amateur baseball leagues founded by former POWs who learned the game in American camps and never quite let it go. They play on Sunday afternoons, older men teaching younger generations, preserving a peculiar legacy of wartime captivity. The baseball that Captain Harrison gave Giuseppe Russo is now displayed in the Florence War Museum, in a case alongside Giuseppe's tattered uniform and his handwritten journal. The ball is signed by a dozen American soldiers, the signatures faded but still legible. Beside it is a placard that reads, "This baseball traveled from Camp Hearn, Texas to Florence, Italy." It represents the moment when enemies became players, when war paused for game, when humanity triumphed over hatred. It is a reminder that the weapons that win peace are different from the weapons that win wars. The story of Italian POWs learning baseball in American camps is a footnote in the vast narrative of World War II. It changed no strategic outcomes, influenced no major decisions, barely registers in military histories of the conflict. But for the men who experienced it, American guards and Italian prisoners alike, those Saturday afternoon games represented something profound about the possibilities of human connection even in the midst of inhumanity. War is won through industrial might, strategic brilliance, and ruthless application of force. But peace is won through smaller gestures, through teaching your enemy a game, through treating prisoners with dignity, through maintaining joy even when the world is burning. The Americans who offered Italian prisoners a chance to learn baseball were not trying to win hearts and minds through calculated psychological warfare. They were simply being American, believing that everyone, even enemies, deserved a chance to play. That belief, more than any military victory, is what Giuseppe Russo remembered and honored for the rest of his life. The war took 4 years of his youth and scarred his homeland. But it also gave him baseball, and through baseball, a vision of what humans could be to each other if they chose connection over division. The Italian soldiers who stood in silence watching their first baseball game in spring 1943 were silent not from hostility or indifference, but from incomprehension. They could not understand how their captors could play games while waging war, how Americans could compartmentalize violence and joy, how the same nation that destroyed their armies could invite them to play catch. But in time, some of them learned. They learned that baseball was more than a game. It was a philosophy disguised as sport. They learned that Americans fought not because they loved war, but because they loved the peace that allowed for games to exist. They learned that maintaining humanity in the midst of horror was not naivete, but wisdom. And they learned to play. Awkwardly at first, then with growing skill and enthusiasm. They learned to swing bats and catch fly balls and run bases in that peculiar counterclockwise pattern that made no European sense. They learned the language of strikes and balls, home runs and errors, wins and losses. But most importantly, they learned that yesterday's enemies could become today's teammates. That shared joy was more powerful than shared hatred. That a baseball, weighing 5 ounces and stitched with 108 red threads, could carry more meaning than all the weapons of war combined. That was America's secret weapon in World War II. Not the atomic bomb or industrial production or military strategy. It was the ability to offer defeated enemies a baseball glove and say, "Want to play?" The Italians fell silent when they first saw baseball because they didn't understand it. But in time, some learned to speak its language. And in doing so, they discovered something unexpected. That even in the darkest hours of human history, joy is possible. Connection is possible. Peace is possible. All you need is a ball, a bat, and the willingness to play.